In today's video, I wanted to talk to you about no-go zones, or probably potentially a better phrase, which is don't go zones, where we can have some considerations around the deterioration of certain neighborhoods in most urban centers, as well as in general the principles of decline of a society reflected in its actual led life, the way that civilians experience their existence. The idea of a no-go zone is rather new in some ways. It represents what is the effects of an alien populace not willing to integrate. And that could be any type of, say, immigrant or resident or citizen even of a country that chooses to probably ensconce itself in a certain neighborhood and thereby give itself jurisdiction almost and a power scope around who enters and what activities are permissible within that space. This is seen obviously as an affront to sovereignty on a state level, and so there's this clash now between the idea of people being able to live their lives in a community and how that community interacts with the rest of the city and obviously our perspective thereof. The current online and media level dialogue is mostly around the either yes, we have no-go zones, but it's not a big problem, and or no-go zones don't exist. It's a conspiracy, usually from the right wing. And in that, I think there's probably a very large tell about how we feel about no-go zones as a principle and as an idea, and that in denial or in acceptance of a fate, we are an accomplice to what is basically our own decline. So if we're in the position of what you'll find most progressives are, which is that there aren't no-go zones, and it's an all big conspiracy theory, trying to demonize happy-go-lucky, earnest immigrants and or residents, then you obviously have someone who's out of touch with certain realities and in denial. I think there's also a misunderstanding, probably in the nomenclature, but in the definitional sense of a no-go zone being somewhere where no one who's not of a certain creed can go. And this is not necessarily true. I think it's best if we think about no-go zones on a scale or gradation whereby the starker the effect, the less ability you have as either a free person or a, say, emergency worker to enter a zone without the threat of something. Now, I would probably like all of you to just imagine that you're a 75-year-old woman who's about 165 centimeters or 5'1" or 2, and you weigh 50 kilograms or 110 pounds or something. Now imagine you're this person, and then you have every neighborhood in your country or in your city that you're capable of walking through at night, to say like 10:30 to 2 a.m. Some time frame like that. Now you should be able to understand that in a high trust society, and we can point fingers here to places like Japan or Singapore, a lot of places in East Asia, Taiwan, but also places like Romania or other Eastern European countries, then you'll probably find there's no risk at all, no material risk, and on a probability basis, a very, very low existential risk. However, when you start to go to the third world, obviously this risk becomes extremely high and dangerous, and no one would recommend you walking around the favelas in Brazil at any time, let alone at night, let alone being an old lady. So us in our septuagenarian dotage have the opportunity to walk around London at what is midnight. Are there areas you wouldn't go? And I think naturally, of course, there are. You're at a prime target and risk for many different versions of crime, typically assault, robbery, battery, and worse nefarious crimes as well. And I think for us, we can then understand that that's an uncomfortable place to be. This is not a neighborhood that's very nice. Now, is it a no-go zone as in you cannot enter it? Obviously not. You can enter almost any suburb in most first world countries without any issues. The dilemma becomes whether or not you consider this low trust, high incidence of risk factor around your personal well-being an issue, and to what degree do you start to consider it an issue? Because in places like, say, London, you've had slums for the last 300, 400 years, potentially longer, which have thrived, and there's been a criminal underclass which has coexisted with what was the town watch or militia through to the peelers, the earliest instances of police. And there's been a community effort around improving and removing the, you call scum off the water here, where we say there is an idea that we all want to live in a nice neighborhood because this feeling of comfort and well-being is enjoyed and it makes life less stressful. We remove that cortisol effect. Now, obviously, you have a transition period in the middle of the 20th century whereby you replace what was an underclass with an immigrant class. And so the existing East Enders, particularly this is for London at least, are completely removed and emigrate outwards into the suburbs and into other areas. Most of them suboptimal in the terms of economic freedoms, but potentially slightly better than the East End. With a large influx of immigrants there, you get what is a new version of an old thing, basically, and these neighborhoods become, once again, maybe not slums is the best word here, but more crime-ridden boroughs, where you have certain instances of certain crimes being proliferated and experienced at higher levels. And so the first chart you can see here is just knife crime, and that there's been an ever-increasing amount of places in London which do actually experience knife crime. And this is not necessarily linearly increasing, but it's more pocketing itself or dispersing itself around certain neighborhoods that have high experience with third world immigration. Basically, it's almost a one-to-one correlation here. So we can consider that probably a negative in terms of, have we improved broader society in a general direction from a high trust well-being standpoint? And you would say probably not. If this, and this is just knife crime, obviously robberies, etc., will be much higher. But I wanted to point out what would be kind of one of the worst versions of crime, I would say, which is that existential threat to one's own self of sense and agency. This can be thought of akin to maybe something like rape or attempted murder, things like this. Gun crime is also fairly indicative of a deterioration rather than improvement. And you can see that in places here like Göteborg, where you have certain neighborhoods where there's a very, very high instance of gun crimes. And the red dots here, I know this is a very small map, but the red dots, as you can faintly recognize here, are grenade attacks. And so there are very clearly neighborhoods and certain areas which are predominantly gang, I don't want to say experiencing, but gang hideouts and areas which are experiencing crime as basically a byproduct of who lives there, rather than necessarily something like economic privation. Because a lot of particularly progressives like to say that the lack of opportunity and lack of economic outlook upon life, positive economic outlook, is a large contributor to criminal life. But there is just a reality that some cultures have a certain glory and honor class around being a criminal and being in a gang, and that they can think of gang activity as something that's a bit more like a business and a career. And so going to jail and all of these things aren't necessarily that negative. They're just fairly normal experiences that most of the people you know participate in these things. Because you have, and my familiarity is strongest in the UK here, but there's something like 7 or so of the worst boroughs or counties in the entire continent of Europe exist in the UK. But not all of those are crime-ridden no-go zones, where you'll probably likely have your watch stolen or your phone stolen or be threatened with a knife. So what's the difference? The difference is obviously that the demographics are different, that the social pressures around what's expected of you are different. But then obviously the glorification of certain cultures is different. So poor people, and this is where I think the leftists and rightists maybe are ignorant. Poor people aren't necessarily violent criminals, at least not more predisposed to that. And that I think there definitely should be more sympathy for someone who has deprivation of economic opportunities. But at the same time, I think we should recognize that there's an inherent cultural leaning towards a lot of these particularly violent crimes, and that pretending as if it's something bigoted or prejudiced to say so is just hoping that the problem goes away by ignoring it. But no doctor would tell you to ignore symptoms of a disease. So why culturally and socially would we do that? What would be the logic here? And obviously there is none. It's because there's not an easy solution. All the hard solutions are not something that's necessarily politically palatable, and thereby what we get is the best attempts to skirt around and circumvent having to deal with actual problems in a way that's going to solve them. The idea that you can appreciate where you live is correspondent to how you treat it, and I think most of the places you'll see have what is trash and detritus, rubbish strewn about. Very unpleasant, smelling unpleasant. They have a lot of those, I don't want to call them fake businesses, but fronts for other things like money laundering, and that can include phone repair shops, candy stores and/or vape stores, barber shops, things like this. If you've lived in a neighborhood that's deprived, you'll probably find a lot of these shop fronts, and they'll be manned by usually immigrant males between the ages of 20 and 55, and they basically operate in a very basic in a very basic way from a money laundering perspective, because you have a lot of drug dealing and prostitution, and then anything other like more petty crimes maybe, or anything up to strong arming businesses for say racketeering, more or less. And so using this principle, you can more or less start to outline areas that are don't-go zones. There's nothing safe or cozy or warm about going to these places where you're treated more or less as an outsider, as an alien in your own country or in your own city, and in a way that's not actually material enough for someone to think that we need to do something about it. Because the West is fairly passive when it comes to acceptance, we have what is a pathological need to be tolerant. Then that is extended towards even people living in our own realm who are unwilling to integrate into our own society. You have much more resistance from this sort of behaviors in almost every country around the world, except Western countries, where the expression of your own individual freedom is something we celebrate, and thereby we have, I would say, a compulsion almost to be giving and have a high threshold of allowance for certain behavior. It has taken Sweden 30 years to basically react to their ever deteriorating civil system. There's been a lot of reports coming out of Denmark about immigrants over the age of, I think, 50 or 55. Something like 2/3 are on welfare. And that will be perpetual welfare until they die. So you're talking about a large segment of the population from those MENAPT countries basically on welfare from age 0 all the way through to 90. So you can see obviously that there's a large burden on what we would call the native population versus the foreign population. But we consider that the price to pay for what we valued as diversity and cultural melting pot or salad maybe is the best way to think about it. But in general, I think that we've hoisted ourselves on our own petard. Obviously, it's a self-inflicted wound where we continue to flagellate ourselves in not being good enough and moral enough and ethical enough, which just leads us to this ratiocination of it's our fault they're not integrating and they're not doing well. What can we do more? Let's throw more money at it, more resources at it, etc., etc. Now, this works in things like, you could say, the slums in London and the arrondissements in Paris in the 19th centuries, where you had huge economic uplift by throwing money at problems because the level of privation was so low that you can bring a lot of people up just with fundamental opportunities in nutrition and structures and systems, which they were severely lacking. And in that, you do actually minimize crime, and you make areas more homely and bucolic. But and this is particularly bad in Paris, obviously. Depending on which arrondissement you live in, then it will more or less determine how much crime you experience and what exactly your feeling about Paris is. You can go from thinking it's the most charming, romantic city in the world to thinking it's a third world shithole. And so those two things are obviously not necessarily too far apart on a geographical basis, which is the striking thing. You can go 1 kilometer either way and have completely polarizing experiences. And I think this is a fairly sound way to understand our own civil destruction, in that if we can more or less ignore them on a daily basis, if we can commit to white flight to a certain degree, then these problems aren't real to us in an existential sense, and then thus no need for us to actually deal with them. It's why we can have people advocating for communism when they don't have to experience it. People can advocate and want other people to pay for certain governmental policies which don't necessarily infect them. And this is that problem you basically have with democracy. It becomes such a burden to the taxpayer who does not have an outsized choice on where their money and how their money gets spent by an ever-increasing government overseer. I think this goes into the first point, that no-go zones, which are definitional on you cannot go in there, are fairly rare, and they'll continue to be scarce in most capital cities, whereby I think there's some in Stockholm and other places in Paris and London where you might necessarily need, if you're an ambulance or a fire truck, some police escort, and even then you'll probably risk some certain reprise with the throwing of stones or slashing of tires or the threats of just physical bodily violence, particularly when it comes to high crime neighborhoods where if a gang member has been shot or stabbed or something, there's resistance towards helping that person, and there's other sort of compounding factors. But I think before I wrap up what is hopefully a fairly fruitful discussion for you to understand the definitional gradation of a no-go zone to a don't-go zone, the two things here maybe I can point out quickly is that you can see here just more evidence. Actually, this is just more, how we call it, pattern recognition. So we use our Bobby Fischer style pattern recognition to decipher certain trends and patterns, and then we can see if we can checkmate the queen. Here is just an illustration of what I took for Berlin. Berlin's stabbings here, fairly predominant in this rather small circle or band all the way through the city and then kind of across. Here is the immigrant population, which follows fairly, I think, strongly here. The red one being, I think, Turkish. Here is house prices, which kind of reflect the balance to a degree. I think you don't necessarily find here economic privation one-to-one with crime and immigration. So that should tell you that actually they aren't all poor people just stabbing each other because they're poor. It does have some other component to it. We can't say that those are coefficients with a perfect R-squared score. And then here is the voting patterns of Berliners, and obviously the most affected boroughs here or counties or suburbs are voting green, and then the vast majority are either voting the rest in communist to some degree or leftist to some degree, and then the CDU being the remainder. And this is fairly typical of what these most big cities look like, that you have a high concentration of certain people in certain areas, and a lot of that results in conflict, and that can be either ethnic or religious or some other form. I think the biggest shame obviously being the admittance, this has been very recently, that the members of Jewish and lesbians or homosexuals are not allowed to, well, not allowed to, they can visit. It's been recommended that you don't, which I think speaks into a no-go zone for certain individuals. And like my experimental septuagenarian old lady, if you are of a certain personage, if you're a female, and particularly female of any age, I would say, I would be very hesitant to walk around most major cities that in the West, particularly Western Europe or America, because you can see what the effects are when you're unaccompanied by either a friend or a boyfriend or something like that. I think there was a large spate of aggressive acts against Asians in a lot of American cities, which speaks directly to this. No one will outright say there are no-go zones in places like Seattle or San Francisco or New York, but at the same time, there's a recognition of a certain demographic which is best to avoid in certain areas. So obviously the PC version of this understanding cannot be said explicitly. But I want to know exactly why we can identify a problem and then not try and fix it. Why is it that we just have to live with this? I fundamentally don't understand the recognition of a problem, yet the inability to solve it. I think if you're as a society, you should be responsible collectively to guide it towards a better place. And we're just not doing that. We're pretending as if these problems are unsolvable, and throwing resources and money at them is going to change fundamentally how people are by their nature. It won't work. There needs to be some proper and actual response to these things, otherwise they'll never stop. And then you'll just have a proliferation and deterioration that's spreading throughout all your neighborhoods in your major metropolitan cities. And there's only so much white flight you can do. It's just nonsense to think that there's a perpetual ability to move and move and move as if it's musical chairs. And so in what is the peroration here, I will say, make sure that this is something where you protect those in your family and those of in your friends circle, and give them the harsh reality here. Don't let them pretend like these places don't exist and then they go wandering and get sexually assaulted or stabbed out in the middle of the night because they were alone. There can't be this innocence and this naivete around these areas. They can be very dangerous. And because it's not necessarily no-go zone, it should be a don't-go zone. And I think you, well, first as a man, need to understand this, but then also educate and provide assurances to the women in your life that this will stop and we will fix this.